Martin North, John Adams, and the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Very good. Good to see you again.
You too.
Special guest today.
Yes, we have a special guest. So we have Emilie from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. So I came across Emilie about a few weeks ago when she testified in front of the Senate Standing Committee on Economics about the cash ban. And she basically gave a very strong testimony as to why the cash ban is a very bad idea. So, we only have a month to go until this is likely to come up for a vote. So we have the next public hearing on the 30th of January. The committee is due to report to the full Senate on the 7th of Feb, and I'm expecting that in the week commencing of the 10th of February, the legislation will come to a vote. So we may have some big news about whether I get to testify in a few weeks' time. But before then, because I had the opportunity to reach out to Emilie on social media, I thought, well, why don't you come down and have a chat to our audience about, the submission from the Taxpayers Alliance, what did they testify to Parliament, and her broader assessment about the legislation and how important this is to Australia. And I think one of the interesting perspectives that Emilie is going to give our audience is she's an American, so she's only been recently in Australia, and so she comes from a point of view where people fought a revolution to secure rights and liberties with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I think Americans understand instinctively more about this issue and why it's important compared to Australians, and I think this is another good element that I think Emilie's going to bring to the conversation.
Well, Emilie, welcome. Great to have you in the show today. And I think we should probably start with the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Who is it? What is it?
So we're the nation's largest grassroots advocacy group representing taxpayers. And we're funded by taxpayers all across Australia who care about the same issues as we do. And we work to reduce taxes, promote common sense regulations, and end government waste.
Okay. Very, very important task then, and a big task in Australia.
Yes, for sure.
You came out heavily against the cash restriction ban and gave very strong evidence. What was the key driver behind that?
I think the biggest point here is trapping people into the banking system and giving the big four banks more power over individual consumers and small businesses. People shouldn't be forced to use bank services if they don't want to. Banks can charge higher fees if they don't have more competition. They can lower interest rates because people are forced to use their services. And this is detrimental to Australians everywhere. About 37% of Australians still use cash, and they should have a right to do so.
So essentially what we're saying is that we have a civil liberty today, and if the restriction bill passed, that would be taken away.
That is correct. And a lot of people see the 10,000 as a big number that's not going to affect them. But in many ways it will, and it will affect the banking sector because more people will be using the banks. The banks are going to be lowering those interest rates and increasing those fees, and that will hurt all Australians.
Now, one of the things that came up was the concept of debanking. In other words, people not being able to use the banking system. I think some of the other evidence that came out was that there were particular industries who had difficulty simply because of the industry that they were in.
Yes, this is surprised a lot of people, but we've had businesses come to us about the cash ban, concerned because they're debanked and they're not allowed to use these services, particularly vape shops. We have a campaign trying to help legalize vaping in Australia. Right now, vaping is legal, nicotine vaping is not. But because there's that association, banks go, we're stepping back, and there's some uncertainty and they have moral qualms. And so they're just debanking people. Tattoo shops have also been debanked. Pubs have been debanked. And these are small businesses that are helping the Australian economy, and we're hurting them through this ban.
Right, so the implication there is that over time, more and more sectors of industry potentially will be more and more difficult for them to actually be able to run their businesses.
Exactly. And if they don't have access to cash, there's no way they can run their business.
Right.
So what actually happens? So a business would have a bank account, or they would have an EFTPOS machine, and they're using these things, and all of a sudden, one of the banks will come up to them saying, well, we don't want to do business with you, and we're just going to take all these services away, and you've just got to scramble and find a way to run your business without us. Is that basically what happens?
That's exactly what's happening. They're just closing their accounts.
They just close it. And do they give the businesses any forewarning? Is there any justification, or they just say we're shutting up shop, and you'll have to fend for yourself?
There's some warning, but not much, and then they're just sent out to fend for themselves, and usually that is through cash. A lot of businesses have used cryptos and are trying to come up with alternatives because they can't use these services.
Sure. And one of the things you said in your testimony that I thought was really interesting is that some of these businesses are now shifting to different payment systems like PayPal or Stripe, but even they are now withdrawing service for some of these businesses. So, and is that the same reason as the banks in terms of their justification for why they're withdrawing their payment platforms for these businesses?
Yeah, it's similar justification. They're having moral qualms. They're uncertain about how long it's going to stay legal, these businesses, whether it's like a vape shop where there's uncertainty there. And so these payments have stepped out and don't want to be a part of it.
There's a lot of Australians who I think believe that it's kind of like a human right that you get a bank account, that you have actually the ability to do business with a bank. So I think that this is the first sort of lesson to say to people, no, you do not have an inherent right to have a bank account. And if you can't use the banks and you can't use independent banking services and you can't use cash, well, how do you do business in an economy?
You don't.
You don't. So in effect, this legislation is actually going to harm not only individual businesses, it's going to harm the economy as a whole, because it's going to make it harder for certain industries to basically provide goods and services to people who want those goods and services.
Exactly. You're going to have perfectly legal businesses completely destroyed because it's not like they can trade sheep or something.
Before I heard your testimony and the testimony from the Small Business Ombudsman, I personally had never heard of debanking. To what extent do you think that the government knew about this issue when they designed this legislation? And do you think they've considered all the possible unintended consequences, or you think that this is just a half-baked policy measure by the government?
I think it's somewhat half-baked. I don't think that they realized at the time when promoting this legislation that it would affect these small businesses. I'm sure some people were aware that debanking happens, but I don't think they took that into account when instituting this legislation.
Do you have like a count as to how many cases that you've come across that have been affected by debanking?
We're actually working on that right now. We're answering a question for the committee and bringing forward a list of these businesses, and there are quite a few, particularly in certain industries, and it's those industries that people are uncertain about or think they have moral qualms about or the media doesn't like that tend to have it. So it's very widespread in the vaping industry. Very few vape shops can use banks.
You just said the media, so are you saying that if the mainstream media doesn't like a particular business or activity, banks will withdraw services based on negative media reports?
Yes. I believe that's what's happening with the vaping industry, and that there's a lot of pushback against the vaping industry. There's been lots of drama around deaths in the United States caused by illegal vaping products, and lots of fear. And the banks are wary, and they don't want to be a part of that, and so they're backing out.
Wow. How many legal businesses are operating across Australia, Martin, that could potentially be affected by the mainstream media, writing a few negative articles that could trigger the banks to saying, well, we're not going to do business with you anymore?
Well, there is evidence of banks being very heavily influenced by public opinion, by the media, and frankly, just being a bully, and basically pulling away banking services. And the point you make is, I think, really important one, John, and that is people assume that access to banking services is a universal right, and yet it's clear that some businesses don't have that right, and this cash ban would make the thing even worse.
Emilie, the other question is, and it's not something that Martin and I have talked about at length, is this issue of the $10,000 threshold being degraded because of inflation. So what I think your testimony was that the cap is basically reduced in real value by $200 a year. And then over 10 years, it'll be back down to about $8,000 in real terms. So even if you have a nominal 10,000 threshold, as incomes go up because of inflation, it's kind of like bracket creep. More people will be trapped by this threshold, and the threshold is not linked to the CPI or anything like that. So can you just explain to our audience as to how did you calculate the 8,000 limit? How do you get from 10,000 to 8,000, and what happens if we actually have a higher rate of inflation than the assumption you used in your calculation?
Yeah, so I assumed a 1.9, It's a very rough estimate.
So that's
Inflation.
1.9 per annum.
Yes.
Yeah, so 1.9% per annum. That's how you got from 10,000 to 8,000 over 10 years.
Yes, and that's being generous. Usually, like in the United States, we aim for 2% inflation. And so I just kind of put that a little bit lower. It's been that way in Australia the last year and estimated from there. And that's how our real buying power will decrease over time.
It's the compounding effect, isn't it? So
Exactly.
every year the limit effectively goes lower and lower and lower, and that means that more transactions are caught. And that's independent of any initiative to drive the limit lower.
Yes, and they've already said that they're planning on taking it lower. The number 2,000 has been thrown out, and ideally, many of these organizations want it to be zero, so you couldn't use cash at all.
We are aware that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, has been subject to statistical manipulation. So we think that the CPI, the rate of inflation, is underreported in Australia because of changes to its methodology by the ABS over a number of years. So in effect, even with the official number of an average of 1.9, if the real rate of inflation is higher than 1.9, a lot more people are going to be trapped in this cash ban over the next 5 to 10 years, more so than even what Emilie sort of testified to Parliament. And again, I think that's a big deal that the policymakers perhaps, maybe they didn't think about it, but I think your testimony was that you think that this is part of the conspiracy to trap more people over time through inflation.
I think it's been clearly stated that they want this cash ban to be much lower.
Yep.
And this is a very effective way of doing it, setting it to a single number that's going to decrease over time with inflation. It will ultimately bring that cash ban down very low.
And it's worth saying that in the other evidence that was provided on the day, they couldn't really justify why the $10,000 limit was actually set in the first place. It seemed to be a number grabbed out of the air.
They made it up.
It's a pretty number. 10,000 sounds nice. It's just...
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So 10,000 sounds nice, but on the other hand, they set it at 10,000. One of the reasons why was because they know that a lower threshold is more politically unpalatable because it affects more people. So they say, well, let's bring this in as a first step, and let's set the threshold high. So there'll be some political cost, but there's not there'll be sufficient sort of cost that allows us to get through through any opposition in public. But again, the senators were asking, well, where's your empirical statistical analysis as to why is 10,000 the magic number? And they just said, well, we don't have it. We just made it up, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, Emilie, one of the things I wanted to ask you was the government had an agenda about tax evasion and money laundering.
Mm-hmm.
From what you saw on the day, were you convinced that this really will actually tackle those issues?
Absolutely not. The European Commission has done quite a bit of research on this, and they found generally with tax evasion, people are using either with small cash amounts to evade their taxes. So you go to a coffee shop and somebody pays $4 for their latte, and it's in cash. Do they report that? Do they not report that? And so that kind of thing does happen, and that's where a lot of the evasion through cash happens. A lot of the bigger tax evasion is these big corporate companies. They've got places overseas where they have their headquarters. Netflix Australia is a good example. And they're likely not breaking the law. It's legal avoidance. They have their headquarters in the Netherlands. They pay taxes in the Netherlands, and they don't pay Australian taxes. And this happens regularly. And this bill wouldn't affect them at all. It wouldn't increase the tax take from the government, because these big companies are legally, through fleets of lawyers, evading their taxes.
And it's worth saying that the original report, when it came out, sort of had this high-level number of an aspirational saving, but it was never really explained as to how that was associated with the particular activities.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been no evidence given as to what savings, if any, tax mitigation, if any, would actually come direct from the cash ban specific area.
Exactly. You've got also money laundering and terrorism were two of the other things that were proposed. Like this would help. Most terrorists don't really care if they're breaking another law,
Right.
and neither do money launderers. So, and generally, the transactions that they're making are going to be smaller, smaller than $10,000. Whether it's renting a car entirely legal to commit an act of terror, these things aren't caught by this cash restriction at all. And similar with money laundering, These people they're trying to get the money into the legal system, and they're filing all the paperwork, and they're really good at it. And so this kind of restriction isn't going to affect them.
And John, the point that you often make at this point is to say, and remember that the real reason for the cash transaction ban is nothing to do with this. It's all to do with negative interest rates and monetary policy.
Well, they keep on saying that we're sprouting a conspiracy theory, and all we're doing is just quoting the technical working papers from the International Monetary Fund, who says if you want negative interest rates, you've got to get cash out of the system. And even the Black Economy Task Force had a reference to say that this will actually help monetary policy. Well, why did they put that in their report? It's all about what the big agenda is, which is about the war on cash.
So there is a very important other undercurrent to this whole conversation. It isn't just about money laundering and tax evasion. So what are your plans in terms over the next few weeks? Is there more lobbying you're going to do, or have you basically done your dash?
So right now we're collecting a list of different businesses and how the banks have stopped serving them, and we're having them present and send letters to their MPs, and we're collecting that list for the committee and sending that in to show these are real people that own small businesses that will be very negatively affected by this.
And what's your sense? Do you think they're just going through the motions, or do you think there is a real concern about the legislation and the real wish to get to the underlying issues?
Did you get the sense that these senators are seriously contemplating whether to vote for or against, or do you think that they've made up their mind and this is just a charade?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm optimistic. And when I was testifying, they asked very good questions. They seemed to really be trying to dig into it. We're very interested by some of the things were said, asked for follow-up. So I think many of the senators on the committee really do want to know who will this bill affect and how.
And that was my sense too, having watched the whole thing, over the relay. They really did ask good questions, and they asked good follow-up questions, which suggested to me they were really seriously probing.
Yeah, there wasn't much grandstanding that I saw, just lots of good questions.
Yep. So what's our feeling then? Is this going to get into law or not?
Hope not. It's not good for Australia if it does. We're going to continue fighting though.
And so given that we've got about a month to go until the full Senate will actually probably vote on this legislation, so there are people who are watching the show who are eager to do more things to lobby politicians to stop this from coming into law. So do you have any advice for our viewers as to potential things that they should be focused on, or things that they could be doing to actually perhaps move the needle with some of these politicians?
It's a small thing, but reaching out to your politicians and telling them what you think. We have a petition up on our website at australiantaxpayers.org. You can sign that petition and it will go to your MP. We're also working on setting up you can tweet your MP, and we're getting that set up on our website, so you can send out a tweet and it'll go to, based on your address, to your MP, and tell them what you think of the cash ban.
Excellent. Well, we'll put some links on our site so that people can go over that as well, because I'm with you. I still think there is a significant opportunity to make sure that our politicians are fully aware of just what we think about this particular bill. And, democracy is all about having a voice. Well, this is a great way to have a voice.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, so before we wrap up today's conversation, I just want to ask one question. Given that you are, you come from the United States and you've only been in Australia for less than a year, so coming at this from an American perspective, how does this sort of issue? I mean, if this issue was being proposed by the U.S. Congress, how do you think Americans would respond to the federal government in the United States saying we're going to limit your ability to use US dollars in private transactions?
I don't think it would go over well. I don't think that the individuals would accept it, and I don't think that the states would accept it, especially on this federal level where it's all across Australia. There's no escaping it. I don't think that it would go over well in the United States.
So just from a factual point of view, so there is no cash ban anywhere in the United States, either from a state level or a federal level?
Not that I'm aware of. Federally, we definitely do not, and in my home state, we do not.
Yeah.
Well, Emilie, I really appreciate your time today. I think John and I both found that a really helpful conversation. I'm sure our viewers will too. So all power to your elbow over the next month or so. We'll be doing our bit too on the interests of people. John, any final thoughts?
Yeah. So we have a few weeks to go. One of the, I think, key points that Parliament doesn't understand is that as we go into more dicier economic times, as unconventional monetary policy becomes more normal across the world, the demand for cash is going to go up. So, one of the key points is that the Reserve Bank keeps on saying the demand for cash is falling because everyone's relying on electronic payments. I think, two aspects. One is when you look at the bushfire situation, and people are going to realise that if the banking system closes down, you can't buy food, you can't get petrol, and we don't want looting or societal collapse. So I think the demand for cash from a natural disaster perspective is going to go up. But on the other aspect is once negative interest rates come into Australia, the demand for physical cash is going to go up. And at that point, this is when this legislation is going to be even more important when you've got inflation and when you've got negative interest rates compared to now. And I think that's one of the key points that the Parliament hasn't thought about. Well, is the demand for cash going to fall going forward? Or is it going to go up? And how many more people are you going to trap in this system? And I guess finally is Emilie's testimony was that this is to help the banks and to trap people in the banking system, and people should have the freedom to conduct commerce in the way that they wish. So I support that perspective wholeheartedly, and we basically should push against Parliament to the greatest extent that we can to say that it's none of your business how we conduct our own economic affairs, as long as we pay our taxes. Just allow us to do business the way we wish to do business.
When banks start misbehaving and when they start acting badly, whether it's charging high fees or lowering interest rates, people are going to wish they could use cash.
That's right.
Yep, and that will be taken away. So in the interest of the people, this is a very important thing to make sure that your voice is heard.
It's a key critical policy threshold for 2020.
John, Emilie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. We'll see you next time.